Assalamu alaikum. I'm just going to begin updating the case that some of you may be familiar with, the lawsuit that I brought in January against President Obama and Leon Panetta over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. Many of you in this room are familiar with the egregious violations of our most basic civil rights in the Article 3 courts, which of course has targeted Muslims in this country. Hundreds of Muslims are incarcerated, many in supermax prisons, primarily for what they believe. And on January 1st, or December 31st, the President signed into law a bill that included a section that I challenged in court that authorized the U.S. military to seize American citizens who were deemed to have links to al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces. That, of course, was a term that was never defined. Hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, strip them of due process until, in the language of Section 1021, the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is, of course, forever. We challenged that, or I challenged it in court. I was joined by other writers like Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, who of course leaked the Pentagon Papers. And this September, Judge Catherine Forrest in the Southern District Court of New York ruled in our favor, declared that law unconstitutional. The reaction of the Obama administration was deeply disturbing. They asked Judge Forrest to issue a stay, a temporary stay, while they appealed it. A stay would have put the law back in force. She refused. When she refused, a few hours later, they demanded both an emergency appeal and an emergency stay. That was a Friday night. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, they went to the appellate court. When a federal court makes a ruling and you appeal it, you go to the appellate court. If the appellate court upholds the ruling, you go to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the appellate court did issue a stay and put the law back into effect. The lawyers and myself can only assume that the reason the Obama administration acted so aggressively is because they are already using that law, most probably with dual nationals, Pakistani, U.S. citizens held in places like Bagram. Because if that law was no longer valid and they were holding U.S. citizens without giving them access to due process, they would be held in contempt of court. This is part of a long battle that you are, as a community, intimately familiar with, and it is not unrelated to poverty. What we have undergone in this country is a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion, a corporate coup d'etat, where all of the impediments to corporate capitalism have been lifted by both of the major political parties. It began under Reagan, but it was certainly accelerated under Clinton with the passage of NAFTA in 1994, which was the greatest betrayal of the American working class since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948 that made it extremely difficult for unions to organize. It was Bill Clinton that destroyed our welfare system, and 70% of the recipients under the old welfare system were children. It was Clinton who ripped down the firewalls between the commercial and investment banks, precipitating the economic meltdown. And it was Bill Clinton who deregulated the FCC. Not a small measure, because it allowed roughly 6 corporations to control the airwaves. 80%, 90% of what most Americans listen to, or watch. Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, and Clear Channel. With all of these impediments lifted, all of these regulations and control of corporate capitalism, we have seen our nation, and indeed the global economy, be rapidly reconfigured into a form of neo-feudalism, a world of masters and serfs. What's happening in the farmlands of India is happening in the farmlands where I grew up in upstate New York. And that is that families and farmers who have sustained themselves for generations are being pushed out, monocrops are being implanted, and agribusinesses are taking over. 250,000 Indian farmers, it is estimated, have committed suicide. There are different types of capitalism. There's that penny capitalism of the farmers in the town where I grew up, where they grew their produce, they brought it into the market and they sold it. There's the regional capitalism of the small business owner who owns the hardware store or a small business and lives in the town and sits on the school board and pays taxes. And then there is corporate capitalism, which is supranational. It owes no loyalty to the nation state. And what is happening is that these corporate forces are, in business terms, harvesting the country. They're taking as much, as fast as they can on the way down. And they are creating a global marketplace where workers, both here and abroad, are told that they have to be competitive, in essence, with prison labor in China and sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour. All of the social programs that save us from destitution are starting this January, when forced budget, draconian budget cuts come into effect, will potentially be sacrificed, whether it's Social Security, Head Start, or food for elders who are shut in. I spent the last 2 years writing a book with the great graphic illustrator Joe Sacco. Some of you may know his work, Palestine, or his masterpiece, Footnotes in Gaza, which unquestionably is one of the great works on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And he and I went into the poorest pockets of this country, Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, Lakota Indian Reservation, where the average life expectancy of a male is 48, the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. At any one time in Pine Ridge, 60% of the residents, many of whom live in sod huts, have neither electricity or running water. The coal fields of southern Appalachia, where big coal, because it no longer wants to dig down for the coal seams, is blowing the top 400 feet off of the mountains, causing a toxic wasteland that will never be reclaimed, hundreds of thousands of acres destroyed, billion-gallon impoundment ponds with heavy metals and toxic sludge. This is what unfettered corporate capitalism does. It turns everything into a commodity that it exploits until exhaustion or collapse. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity. And there's a very prescient book by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation, written in 1944. It's a study of unfettered capitalism. And he argues that when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value, when everything is judged solely on its monetary value, then that society cannibalizes itself until it dies. And we can see that cannibalization as 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts, and the response of the corporate state is to mine the last vestiges of fish, gas, oil, and minerals. It is as if we are all aboard the Pequot in Herman Melville's masterpiece Moby Dick, led by Ahab's, and Ahab, of course, who brought the ship and everyone down with him, said, my motives, my means and my methods are sane, my motives are mad. This, unfortunately, is the world that we have bequeathed to our children. We have built a system that has the facade of democracy, but internally has rendered the citizen impotent. It is a system best described by the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin as inverted totalitarianism, and by that he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It does not find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in classical totalitarian regimes, you have a demagogue or a charismatic leader who calls for moral renewal, new glory, and vengeance. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of patriotism, and the Constitution, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power. When Joe and I began this book, this study of what happens, or the insanity of forcing a society to kneel before the dictates of the marketplace, and we went to these sacrifice zones like Camden or McDowell County or the produce fields in Florida where undocumented workers pick our produce, to show what happens when corporate power has no restraints, what it does to individuals, what it does to families, and finally what it does to the very ecosystem on which the human life depends for existence. We named the book Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but of course, revolt was conjecture. And in the last few months of our work arose Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park. And we wrote our final chapter, Days of Revolt, out of Zuccotti Park. When you have a system that is hostage to corporate power, a two-party system equally dependent on corporate money and equally subservient to corporate interests, what you do in essence is create a very frightening political paralysis, an inability on the part of the ruling elite to respond to the injustices, grievances, and suffering of the majority of its citizens. And political paralysis, if we have seen throughout history, is an exceedingly dangerous phenomenon in times of distress. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia for the New York Times, and I watched its work. The longer political paralysis continues, the more the state is unable to respond rationally to the crisis, which is precisely what's happening here and in Europe. The more you empower very frightening extremes. This was one of the major concerns of Dostoevsky. His novels Demons, Notes from Underground, is precisely about this defeated liberalism, the defeated dreamer. And Dostoevsky says that when there are no mechanisms within a society to create incremental or piecemeal reform, when you are enveloped by that paralysis, you enter what he calls an age of moral nihilism. I was deeply involved in the Occupy movement. I held with my friend Cornel West a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park. We brought people who had lost their homes, New York City public school teachers who had lost their jobs, to testify, and then we marched on Goldman Sachs, several hundred of us, where there was a group of us who were arrested when we obstructed the entrance. And I think that the power of the Occupy movement is that it first of all made clear where power lies, and that is with Wall Street, with the international financiers. And Goldman Sachs, of course, runs the largest commodity price index in the world, which means that it buys up futures of basic staples, wheat, corn, livestock, and holds them to drive up the prices. Wheat, of course, has increased in price by 100% over the last year. And when that happens, people around the globe, and in particular children, starve to death. I covered the famine in the Sudan in the late 80s, in which tens of thousands of Sudanese died, and those who die in famine tend to be the children and the elderly. I was in vast feeding tents where hundreds of people around me were dying of tuberculosis in the final stages of their weakened condition. There are streaks in my lungs where I was infected with that tuberculosis, but because I was privileged and fortunate and healthy, was able to fight off that disease. And when I stood or sat obstructing the entrance of Goldman Sachs, I brought the whispers of those dead, those marks in my lungs with me. What happens inside these large corporations when one speaks in religious terms is a propagation of systems of death, quite literally, for the poor, the weak, the vulnerable. And it is now incumbent upon all of us who care about those who suffer to make the personal commitment which is required by civil disobedience to stand up against these forces. In environmental terms alone, we have very little time left. Neither Barack Obama or Mitt Romney will impede the power of the fossil fuel industry to determine our relationship with the ecosystem. There is no way within the American political establishment to vote against the interests of ExxonMobil or Goldman Sachs. All resistance is finally a moral act, and I think I speak as someone who comes out of the church and seminary, and I know I speak to many of you who find your center of gravity and faith. It is important for those of us who care about nurturing and protecting life to be willing to stand up in the face of these systems through nonviolence, through peaceful means, and defy them. Yesterday, I was in a nursing home in the Bronx, visiting my good friend, the Father Daniel Berrigan, one of the great peace activists of this country. And Berrigan, who spent 23 months in a federal prison for burning draft records during the Vietnam War, says that those of us who are believers have a duty. We are called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then to let it go. That faith is the belief that the good draws the good to it, that the good goes somewhere, even if all of the empirical evidence around us seems to prove otherwise. The Buddhists call it karma, and I think that the moral force of our religious communities will become, as we enter a period of economic and imperial decline, as we struggle with the effects of climate change, perhaps the most important element within American society. Next Sunday is the 11th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan, and I and many veterans from Veterans of Peace will be at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in New York City on 55 Water Street at 6 o'clock on Sunday night. That park closes at 10. Most of those veterans, many of whom are from the Vietnam War, will not leave to protest that war. And I invite any of you who are in New York to join us. I think that we have to begin to stand up as the teachers in Chicago stood up to struggle for the protection of their union and their jobs, breaking with traditional labor and breaking with the two-party system. And I fear, finally, in closing, that as I saw in Yugoslavia in a time of economic collapse, societies in this kind of instability can vomit up some extremely frightening figures. Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, or of course you can go back to Weimar Germany. America is a deeply violent society. I don't have to tell any of you who come from the Middle East that. And we have powerful proto-fascist movements within this society. And by proto-fascist movements, I am speaking of the Christian right, the Tea Party, the militia, and other groups that do what proto-fascist or fascist movements do, and that is direct a legitimate sense of betrayal and rage towards the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, gays and lesbians, feminists, liberals, intellectuals. They have a very long list of people that they hate. And they speak in the language of violence, and they celebrate the gun culture. And for those of us who seek to defend what is left of our anemic democracy, who seek to rein in an expanding imperium that, like all expanding imperial forces, engenders its own collapse. And we can already see with internal instability how the violent, harsh, anti-democratic measures on the edge of imperial power migrate back to the homeland to keep control. Any of you who comes from places like Oakland or anyone else knows that a night raid in the city looks no different from a night raid in Fallujah. The same Kevlar plates, the same black uniforms, the same night vision goggles, the same automatic weapons, the same command and control centers, and the same helicopters that circle overhead. The assault by the Obama administration on civil liberties has been worse than under George W. Bush. The interpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens, and I'm speaking, of course, of Anwar al-Awlaki, and 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son. The FISA Amendment Act, and I'm a plaintiff in the ACLU lawsuit, which is now being heard by the Supreme Court to challenge that act, which retroactively made legal, and retroactively because the telecommunications companies, Verizon, AT&T, had handed our personal information over to the government in violation of our constitutional rights, and so these telecommunications companies needed this act to be retroactive to save them from the lawsuits that were working their way up in the lower courts, and they got it. The right to monitor, wiretap, and eavesdrop all of us, and of course store our information in a supercomputer in Utah. The use of the Espionage Act, which was designed as a foreign secret act, 6 times by the Obama administration to shut down whistleblowers within the government who exposed corruption, lies, and war crimes, including the CIA official Sterling, who exposed war crimes being committed in Guantanamo to the New York Times, allegedly. And as a former investigative reporter, I can tell you that at this point, it is impossible for a reporter to challenge the official sanctioned narrative of the government because anyone inside government is terrified of going to prison. And of course, as I finally mentioned, the National Defense Authorization Act. And when Judge Catherine Forrest wrote her 112-page opinion, she correctly pointed out that it is this section that permits the government to essentially delegitimize an entire group of people. She brought up the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans in World War II. And of course, the people in times of turmoil that will be targeted first are Muslim Americans. So I close by asking you not to be passive. Going to jail, and I've been a few times in the last year, is more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government. However, I believe it is the only option those of us who care about a civil society have left. Shukran. Maslama.